what is your view of what things we could or should do towards that debate? You know, it could range from nothing through to this. So, what is your view about that?
I do think that persuading as many people as possible to write to their MPs is the most important thing, because they um, always say to you when you ask them about Europe, my constituents aren't interested in Europe. I don't get any mail about it. There's no pressure coming from the electorate. I think the single most important thing, and perhaps more important than anything, is to have people, constituents writing to MPs and strongly suggesting to them that their votes will be influenced by the reaction of the MP to the European issue. Because that's what politicians, democratic politicians, understandably respond to. They want to get re-elected, and if they're not going to get re-elected, then they want to know what they can do in order to give themselves a better chance of being re-elected. So I do think that's absolutely crucial.
I find that we spend we're on two battlefields. We fight the Brexiteers, the few that remain anyway, and we try and convert the soft ones into believing that it was a bad idea, which is quite an easy game these days because we don't have to do that. A lot of the soft Brexiteers know that it's over. But the big game that's difficult is persuading the Remainers to have a coherent view of anything, and they're fed stuff particularly by EM, but not EM alone, that we have to be patient, we have to wait, we can't ask for too much because we lost, and all of those messages are embedded in the Remainers quite badly, I would say.
It's difficult to see how you can be effective when you're saying we've got to be patient. The point of being a lobbying group is that you don't want to be patient, that you're trying
Yeah,
to drag
precisely.
people in your direction. And if you don't do that, then seriously, what are you there for?
And my point, which I've rehearsed many times to Labour MPs, including Stella Creasy the other week, and they don't have answers to this because I was told that in 2032, if we're all quiet, Labour will rejoin one weekend when nobody looks, as if the media don't know what they're doing.
Yes,
This
but
is a
but I was talking about that when I talked about this idea that somehow we would rejoin the single market. Not sure that that's possible, by the way, but even if it were, then gradually, without anybody noticing, we'd walk back into the European Union. And I think that's just crazy.
so.
Uh, the only people who think that are the reform people. I'm standing in a council by-election at the moment. The reform people claim to believe that this Labour government is committed to rejoining the European Union. I don't know whether that's a political stance that they're adopting or whether they really believe it. But my jaw dropped when I was asked to believe that because it's so obviously untrue.
Yeah, so when I answer the Labour people about this, I point out several things. One is that as a business person, in 2032, most of the damage will be done and much of it irreversibly shut. So I mean like company relocations, they will happen on a generational basis. They won't suddenly rush back. So some of that damage will be irreversible and complete. So we'll be in a real mess by 2032. Also, if we can't muster a few people on the streets in 2024 who can understand the causal effect between their lived experience and Brexit, how will we do that in 2032? And every Labour MP I've ever spoken to who tells me that in 2032 it'll be all right, they all go away very quiet at that point.
There's supposedly a famous Foreign Office phrase that there are only two options ever put to the minister. One, originally, when he asked, what do we do about Hong Kong or something, too early to say, minister, too early to say. And then a millisecond later, it's too late to do anything about it. And 2032, very much falls into that category. Another version of it I've heard is 2038, which is, of course, the doctrine of unripe time, writ very large. And then you get to 2032 or 2038 and say, well, unfortunately, all the hopes we were investing in it turned out to be a delusion. What a pity.
John Curtis stood out and did say that the time to campaign to reach, although he believed that it was unpalatable for Labour to try and do much about it because there wasn't enough time to harvest the benefits by 2029, he did say that the time to campaign for it was now. And that was quite helpful.
Yes, yes, I agree. Because what's the point of campaigning when everybody's convinced? You don't need to campaign at that point. You UKIP, much though I think their contribution to British public life was a very negative one, did have one thing right, that it's not just a question of what you say logically and factually, but it's also a question of the conviction with which you say it. If you're convinced of the rightness of your own cause, then that registers with the electorate, even before they look at the details of what you're saying. Whereas during the referendum, for instance, the way in which every single governmental or official utterance about the referendum had to begin, of course, the European Union's got many faults and we want it to be reformed, but on balance, we think we ought to stay in. Well, that's a perfectly reasonable point of view. But if that's the only argument which is being put forward from the Remain side, then it shifts the balance of enthusiasm and conviction very much in the other direction. People who haven't themselves examined all the detailed arguments are impressed by the fact that even the people who supposedly are in favor of remaining spend so much time apologizing for the supposed faults of the European Union.
I mean, when UK was in the EU, I got a job in Germany. I lived in Germany for 3 years, and we weren't a member of Schengen. So I'm not sure what the benefits of Schengen are. If we're in the EU, we're going to get free movement anyway. So what's the value added of Schengen?
Collaborating on criminal matters much easier within Schengen, and it's important to distinguish between Schengen and free movement. Free movement that you're talking about is the right to take up jobs anywhere that you want within the European Union. The Schengen arrangement is a passport-free area, and it's now much more difficult for people to travel within the European Union, and it's going to get more difficult when further formalities are introduced. As you know, you have to have your passport stamped. That's something that didn't happen before. And I think that the United Kingdom has regarded itself as being an island off Europe, and Schengen was one of the ways in which it emphasized that difference. I can't see any problem about rejoining or joining Schengen, and I see advantages to doing so.
I could follow up. I mean, Ireland might be a complication, right? Because we have a free movement area with Ireland, and Ireland is not a member of Schengen. So if we join Schengen, then that would create a border between Northern Ireland, and they're going to be a difficult option for UK.
No, if we rejoin Schengen, then Ireland will be very happy to. If we join Schengen, Ireland would be very happy to join as well. They would prefer. It's only because of the United Kingdom that they're not in Schengen.
Charles Radley earlier on mentioned about Ireland and UK and that all being a little bit awkward. That comes from the common travel area, which pre-existed EU, EEC, all of those things, Charles. So I believe that will remain in place, but there's bigger things embedded into the Good Friday Agreement here in Northern Ireland that require a lot of the structures that the EU supports, the European Court of Justice, Court of Human Rights, all of those things. Anyway, the question I was going to ask was, does this type of meeting count as campaigning, do you think?
Yes, I think it does, in the sense that if people leave it in the conviction that if you want to rejoin, you've got to argue for rejoining, and that the idea of a reset is unsustainable, then I think that is what the Germans call Meinungsbildung, the building up of opinion. It's not going to change everything overnight, but I think when people say you shouldn't preach to the choir, to the or to preach to the converted, well, that's exactly what priests do every Sunday. Most of the people they preach to are the converted, and they're hoping, understandably, to motivate them and reinforce them and give them sustenance for their faith. So I think that in a very, very small way, this is campaigning. Yes, it's a remarkable thing that with the elites having given so little political salience to rejoining the European Union, you get these opinion polls, which of course have to be taken not with a pinch of salt. And even for the electorate themselves, there's a different kind of salience. It's when you ask people, do you think there should be more money spent on development aid? And many people say yes, but they don't think through the implications of it for themselves. I agree with you that politicians could do more to give, if they wanted, to give salience to the European issue, but it is strange and noteworthy that even without that salience being given by the political elites, the electorate have very definitely come to the conclusion that Brexit isn't working.
On salience and Overton windows, Brendan, in the last election, I was the only point of disagreement I had with the Labour candidate in my area was when she stood up and said, nobody mentioned Brexit on the doorstep. And I said, you're absolutely right. They did, however, mention all the offspring of Brexit, in other words, the cost of living, the NHS, yada, yada. I produced a long list. I said, many of whom these issues have 1 foot or more feet in Brexit. So I said, of course, parties have all agreed to rub the word out.
Chomsky used to say that that the reason why America was an imperfect democracy was that people certainly chose, but it wasn't they who decided which were the options that were put before them. And that's very true about Brexit, that if you rub it out, as you say, then the likelihood of people being able to choose what I think and what I suppose many of you think is the rational option is much, much less. And this is reinforced, by the way, by our eccentric electoral system. For instance, I, for the first time in my electoral experience, was told by somebody at Finchley Central Tube that she was sympathetic to what the Rejoin EU party stood for, but she wasn't going to vote for it because it might let reform in. Now, interestingly, at the general election, it was, I'm not going to vote for you because it might let the Conservatives in. Now, not going to vote for you because it might let reform in. Now, there is a rationality to that, of course, that what they say, but it's a phenomenon of our electoral system, which has become perverse against itself. When you had 2 big parties, there was an argument, I think, for first past the post. When you have a fragmentation of the political spectrum like you have at the moment, all sorts of paradoxical outcomes and choices flow from this eccentric system. When I was campaigning on one occasion, somebody who I met, someone from the Foreign Office, actually, I'd met in the Foreign Office. He popped up, so I was very interested to see that you were standing for the European Parliament. You do know that the European Parliament is completely powerless, don't you? And I gave him a couple of minutes of the Donnelly eloquence on the subject of the European Parliament, and it clearly hit home with him. And at the end of it, he said, "Well, that's very interesting. Will you be voting?" I asked him. "Oh no," he said, "it's obviously got too much power, and I don't want to encourage it." So that there was always this contradictory view of the European Parliament, because, as you imply, it gives the lie to the idea that the European Union is an unrepresentative body. It does have a democratic legitimacy, but that's why, or one of the reasons why, its opponents are so eager to present it as corrupt, incompetent, and ridiculous, because they know that for all its faults, it is an element of supranational democracy within the European Union.